Hello everybody, thanks to Siobhan and thanks to Emer, and of course thanks to my old student Dermot. So thank you for organising all of this. This weekend the Tailteann Cup, the second tier. I'm not going to talk about the Tailteann Games, by the way, so you've been here as in from 1924 onwards. I'm going to talk about what happened before 1924. This weekend, the Tailteann Cup, the second tier All-Ireland senior football competition, begins with matches between 16 counties, the most important of which, of course, is the meeting of Offaly and London in O'Connor Park, Tullamore. This is a competition which the players definitely did not grow up dreaming of playing in, but the word Tailteann has a lore which goes back to the very founding of the Gaelic Athletic Association in 1884. And from that decade of the 1880s, the idea of the revival of a Tailteann Games, or the Tailteann Games, had gained a huge currency within Irish Ireland revivalists. In fact, it became part of the national project, soaked in myth and in history. So where did that come from? Well, first of all, what was the myth? The myth was that it was created and rooted at Tara, which lies at the idea at the centre, at the heart of an ancient Ireland, the symbol of a united Gaelic island, where all the tribes were drawn together under one kingship. And this unity was indeed symbolised again and again by the idea of the Éanach Tailteann, the Tailteann Games, which was said to be a vast week-long assembly rooted in politics, a fair, entertainment and athletics contest, where the clans of Ireland united in peace for hundreds of years. According to legend, the Tailteann Games was initiated by Lug Lá Bhada, that is Lug of the Long Hand, in honour of his mother or stepmother, Queen Tailté. Those of you who are scholars of ancient Greece or know about much of ancient Greece history will know that the Olympic contests and other sporting events from that period are themselves created as the idea of funeral games, and that lies at the heart of sporting events there. So in this rendering of the history of the Tailteann Games, it was claimed to have first been established in 632 BC at what we now know as Tailteann in County Meath. And as I say, they were the funeral games to celebrate the life of Queen Tailté. It was believed that the festival was opened with a religious ceremony led by a chief druid. Then there was a truce proclaimed in all wars and disputes for the duration of the games, and finally the funeral games themselves took place in honour of the dead. And these games were said to include various athletic and equestrian events. There were also to be cultural contests in poetry, music and dancing. And alongside that, as a kind of an old day coppers, marriages were arranged and goods were sold and exchanged. So this is supposed to have run from 632 BC, and conveniently or concerningly, depending on which way you want to look at it, it was considered that the last record of these original games was in 1168 AD. Those of you who know your history will know that this was just before the English invasion of 1169, which is the kind of neat history which ordinarily should make you somewhat concerned about where myth actually meets history. I should note in passing that it was not enough for Irish nationalist revivalists and propagandists to claim that the games were real and verifiable and to give detail on their nature, but also that they were actually the oldest known collective games in the world. Perhaps the finest exposition of these views come from T.H. Nally. Now, T.H. Nally is without doubt the most unlucky, and this is a prize worthy of, or quite competitive for T.H. Nally, probably the most unlucky dramatist in Irish history. His play, The Spancel of Death, which he wrote in 1915, was due to open at the Abbey on Easter Monday 1916. Regrettably, it has never been performed to the best of my knowledge, although there was a reading from the stage of the Abbey 99 years later in 2015, again on Easter Monday, though he wasn't there to enjoy the moment, I suppose, is the thing to say. Well, Nally wrote in 1924 a book called Éineacht Tailteann and the Tailteann Games, Their Origin, History and Development. He wrote in that book that the far-famed Olympic Games of ancient Greece drew their inspiration from the still much more ancient games in Ireland. Not merely the idea of the games, but the actual games themselves, their sequence at the festivities, the rules under which the various contests were held, and even the very bylaws regulating the conduct of the people before, during, and immediately after the celebrations were all borrowed en masse from those already in operation in this country. Basically, the Irish had taught the Greeks how to play. Most importantly, the revivalists' interpretation of the meaning and importance of Éineacht Tailteann was given currency by the writings of Owen MacNeill. MacNeill was not only the most important early Irish scholar of this period, but was also, when the Irish Free State was founded in 1922, a minister sitting round the cabinet table which decided to restage the Tailteann Games. He was Minister for Education. In one of his books, MacNeill wrote that not only were the Tailteann Games held annually, but he also invested in them a nationwide constitutional function. For example, in his book, Early Irish Laws and Institutions, O'Neill wrote of the National Assembly held annually at Tailteann in the Valley of the Boyne. So you can see the myth is sport, but the myth is also sport and politics, and the myth is sport and a united Ireland. So how do you confront that myth? The most convincing analysis of what actually happened at Tailteann is provided in a 1958 article called The Fair at Tailteann and the Feast of Tara, which was written by Professor D.A. Binchy. Binchy says that it is true that there was a fair at Tailteann, and he calls it a genuine historical institution. He says that it seems to have lasted for a week during the festival at Lunasa, possibly beginning on the first Monday in August, a kind of a long-standing traditional day of celebration in rural Ireland, which continues but which extends before the Christian period and runs the whole way through. And Binchy points out that there is evidence recorded in the annals from the 8th century onwards of this genuine historical institution. He says that the exact start date of the Éineacht is unclear, but he does say that it seems from the annals that it was held on an annual basis until the Annals of Ulster note that it wasn't held in 873. And thereafter, the Éineacht was held much less frequently and was not held at all, and this really matters, was not held at all between 927 and 1006 AD. That is, for more than 70 years, it wasn't held. The games were then revived in 1006, and a long poem, was written to celebrate this by Cuan O'Loughlin in that year. In this poem, the Éineacht Tailteann is depicted as an annual celebration which had the involvement of the Firbulg, the Tuatha Dé Danann, and the descendants of Meath in succession from the death of Queen Tailté, through to the visit of St. Patrick, who he said went to the fair and gave it his blessing and laid down himself rules for the behaviour of those who attended. Cuan O'Loughlin talks about the seats reserved at the Tailteann Games for the kings of all the provinces of Ireland, and even people who attended from the Celtic nation in Scotland. I think the clue in what this is the fact that he talks about the involvement of the Tuatha Dé Danann and the Firbulg, that is, mythological figures, and it is clearly a poem and not a historical work. Yet later, historians and revivalists seem to have adopted much of its content almost as a fact, as a historical fact, as evidence for it, and among them was Owen O'Neill. So ultimately, what D.A. Binchy did in his conclusion was dismiss what O'Neill had to say about the Tailteann Games, or the Éineacht Tailteann, to say it was a 20th century gloss on an 11th century fairy tale, and ultimately a cautionary example of the triumph of legend over history. The legend, though, is hugely influential, and those of you who know anything about Irish history know the importance of legend and its impact on the beliefs of people and how it pushes into history and reshapes it and changes it. and makes people believe things or leads them to believe things that they either wish to believe or which they are themselves encouraged to believe. And one of the people who was influenced by this in the 1880s was Michael Davitt. So Michael Davitt, the founding leader of the Land League, the patron of the GAA, and one of the greatest and most impressive figures in modern Irish history. He called for a revival of the Tailteann Games in 1884. He said that these games should be a national festival, not only of athletics, but also of music and poetry involving the Celtic race throughout the world. To help fund such a games, the GAA agreed that they should do this, and to help fund the games, they sent a team, as Mike has written brilliantly about, sent a team of hurlers, footballers, and athletes to America in 1888 to both establish the GAA there, it was called the American Invasion, and to raise money. The tour was a disaster. This invasion did not work. There was poor weather, poor organisation, and other difficulties, which meant that the American invaders ran out of money. Maurice Davin, then president of the GAA, had led the invasion, and he was forced to send a wire to Michael Davitt in Ireland asking him to bail out those who were stuck in America now to the tune of more than £450, a huge sum of money in the context of the 1880s. Worse than the loss of money was the loss of men. More than 20 of the original touring panel of 51 remained permanently in America, did not come home at all. And another dozen returned to Ireland only to tidy up their affairs, to say goodbye before going to live and work permanently in America. The idea of reviving the Tailteann Games was then shelved by the GAA in the middle of the 1880s, although it retained a certain currency among the Irish Ireland revivalists, and I know Kevin is going to talk a little bit about this as well, and John Devoy's involvement as one of the people who called from it is an example of it. Not only did it retain a certain currency, the construction of this All-Ireland Festival of Sport and Culture was seen in the context of the creation of modern sport, as was happening around the world at the time, the perfect vehicle for Irish Ireland revivalists to give substance to their idea in a practical way of what an independent Ireland might look like. That is to say, an Irish Olympics would make real the idea of an Irish nation, and physical events, physical behaviour would say that we had survived conquest and colonisation. We were back after 750 years, heading for 800 years of oppression. The establishment of the Irish Free State in 1922 eventually provided the opportunity to hold such a Tailteann Games. Indeed, one of the first decisions, this is quite extraordinary, but one of the first decisions made at a cabinet meeting by the new Free State government was to stage the Tailteann Games, and ultimately to give the Gaelic Athletic Association £10,000 to renovate Croke Park to stage the opening and closing ceremonies. J.J. Walsh was the driving figure behind the Games. He's best remembered as the cabinet minister who later established 2RN, which became RTE, the Irish radio station, and also as the man who had the red post boxes of Empire painted green after the establishment of the Free State. Walsh had fought in the General Post Office in 1916 and later became a successful businessman. His greatest talent was to be considered his organisational skills. I should note in passing that his memoir is a brilliant book published in the 1940s, which regrettably ended up with apparent broad sympathies for fascism, not least the fact that he was in a Zeppelin over Argentina at certain stages in his life, and so on. It's kind of chilling to read the manner in which his life story changed as he moved towards death, and something of a cautionary tale. He had first displayed the organisational skills, though, that led him to success as chairman of the Gaelic Athletic Association in Cork, which gave him a prominence within the association and a great platform with which to display his skills. At the Irish Race Congress held in Paris in 1922, Walsh set out his vision for how sport was fundamental to what an independent Ireland should become. He saw sport as a means, as he said, to help propel the nation towards the great destiny to which we all feel Ireland is called. More precisely, he saw Tailteann Games as a means of bringing to world notice the athletic prowess of the Irish race. In fact, when he was speaking in Paris in January 1922, Walsh might even have been presiding over an actual Tailteann Games. In fact, earlier in 1921, it was considered by cabinets under the presidency of Eamon de Valera, between the truce in the summer of 1921 and the signing of the Treaty of December 1921. Indeed, in October 1921, there were cabinet meetings of the Provisional Dáil cabinet, which read, President to get J.J. Walsh's views on the organisation of the Tailteann Games in Paris. And then it says on November 21, before even there was an Irish Free State, J.J. Walsh to be informed that he may proceed with the organisation of this Tailteann Games in Paris with the Irish Race Congress on the understanding that £2,000 be made available by the Dáil. In the end, it proved too much to organise these games in Paris in 1922 before the establishment of a Free State, but it was then decided after the establishment of the Free State that the Games would be held in Dublin in the summer of 1922. A cabinet meeting on the 27th of February 1922 was asked that £10,000 may be made to Croke Park to convert it into a suitable venue for the Games. And it was decided to grant it immediately once the transfer of powers had been made from the British government. The model for the Games was then announced by Walsh to the Dáil on the 1st of March 1922. It was, he said, based on the 1920 Antwerp Olympic Games and was to take place across 8 days in August 1922. There was to be hurling and Gaelic football, athletics, water sports, equine sports, chess, which the Irish, of course, had invented, golf, tennis, billiards, motorbike racing and speedboat racing, again, a proud ancient Irish sport, aeroplane racing, literature, sculpture, music, dancing and poetry. Interestingly, no sport banned by the GAA was allowed. That is hockey, cricket, soccer and rugby. Yeah, whatever happened to them. When Walsh stood up in the Dáil, he explained the inclusion of rounders as well by saying that rounders was the parent of baseball, and so therefore it would have to be included. And he explained the inclusion of airplane racing and motorbike racing as being part of the social life of the nation, and their introduction will help to vary the attractions of the carnival and give national colour as well as stimulus to those widely divergent forms of public amusement. So that was on the safe side of fine because it wasn't banned by the GAA. But it's wrong to see this as just a narrow nationalism. Entirely wrong to do so. Because Walsh stands in the Dáil and he said, it is intended that Ireland should be drawn closer to Europe through occasional internationals in the capitals of the continent. They looked out as well as in. They just didn't want to look to Britain. Through that spring and into the early summer, the new government continued to give money. Total payments in respect of the 1922 Games was £6,500, as well as the £10,000 given to the GAA. That money was voted to the GAA, eventually passed over to the GAA in July 1922. But by then, the Games were unravelling. On the 7th of July 1922, a telegram from America said that the team would not travel. The telegram simply read, "Fighting in Dublin cause. Peace will revive American sentiment, ensuring full team." In other words, the Civil War had started. J.J. Walsh, though, was in denial about that war and in denial about the idea that the Americans wouldn't come. Back in February, when divides over the treaty were beginning to flare into full view and there was a slide towards violence, Walsh had categorised this divide as the present political difference, as if this was a sort of an argument in the antechamber of a county council. But by June, the forecourts were in flames as the standoff between pro and anti-treaty forces passed into open warfare. And by July, this warfare was spreading around the country. Remarkably, still in denial, on the 11th of July, J.J. Walsh reported to the Cabinet that the Tailteann Games Committee had decided to go ahead anyway. He was asked by the Cabinet to advise the government whether he really thought the Games should proceed. Within 2 days, it was clear that the revival would have to wait. The Tailteann Games organising committee, having initially resolved to go ahead regardless, on reflection, took the view, as violence gripped the land again, that postponement was now unavoidable in the summer of 1922. And there was no prospect of a Games being held while the Civil War continued. That Civil War, of course, ended in May 1923, and by March 1924, the government was again considering supporting staging the Games. I will leave my part of the story there. That is to say, that story, the tracing of a legend and its intersection first into Irish history and then into a programme for government. The realisation of the Games lies in the paper that follows. These are the Games that did actually take place after the ones that didn't.